was an 8-month journey and adventure to put and pull all this together. And I just want to real quick, I want to recognize our Summit Planning Committee members who dedicated their time and their ideas and to making this event a reality. So just real quick, a quick thank you to all of our Summit Planning Committee members. Mary Hensley from BSPRA, who is the director for Jefferson County, Montana. Mary the Mayor, as we all know her as. And also, if you guys have been enjoying that candy on the table, you need to find Mary and give her a big pat on the back because that was all her. Nobody asked her to put candy out. She just did it because she's awesome. Other planning committee members, Jerry McDonald was part of our committee, so thank you, Jerry. Ryan Caparood with BNSF stationed here in Billings was a huge help to us as well. Mark Quam with All Aboard Minnesota. And finally, Dan Bilka with All Aboard Northwest and RPA. Thank you, Dan. Also, those were the official committee members. I also want to give a quick shout out to Mike Christensen with the Utah RPA. Mike was also very involved, and especially here at the end. I know a lot of the panelists got a lot of emails from Mike because he was helping wrangle all of you together with your moderators, and also with Boise City Council President Elaine Clegg, who was engaged throughout the entire process and had a lot of good thoughts and ideas to offer as we work this out. So again, thank you to all of our planning committee members for helping put this event together and helping make it a fantastic event. All right, with that, it is 1:01 p.m., so let's get started on our next session, session 9, Passenger Rail, Freight Rail Synchronicity, which sounds really weird maybe, but the whole idea of this panel is something that got talked about in the last panel, and that's the idea that, passenger rail and freight rail need not be at odds, and that especially that when you invest in one, you invest in the other. Improving the track infrastructure to allow for passenger rail also creates opportunities and efficiencies for better freight rail service and vice versa. Again, an investment in one is investment in another. And especially with our last guest there, Mr. Commission, I think it's important to note, certainly in my opinion, that this country, we really need to get real serious again about investing in our rail network, not just for passenger rail, obviously we want to talk about that, but for freight rail as well. Because I look at our rail network today, and I don't know that we could take or do what the Ukraine is doing. If we were hit with an invasion, or the Yellowstone caldera blew up, or Mount Rainier went ballistic, or a tsunami hit the West Coast, whatever it was, if we needed to move people and goods quickly by rail out of a disaster area, I don't know that we could achieve it right now. So we need to rethink and recommit ourselves to investing in our rail infrastructure, which again will benefit both passenger and freight. So that's what this panel is about. And so Dan, we'll bring you up here as our moderator. And our panelists include, once again, we have Dava Kaitala from Jacobs, Kat Dobbs with HDR, and we'd also like to welcome Rick Harnish with the High Speed Rail Alliance. Thank you guys, and all yours, Dan.
Thank you, Jason. Well, just to be able to hop right into it, basically, again, I'm Dan Bilka with All Aboard Northwest. I also serve on the National Rail Passengers Association Board of Directors. Again, we are joined today with Sean Jean-Scale with the Rail Passengers Association, Vice President of Policy, Rick Harnish, High Speed Rail Alliance, Founder and Director, David Kaitala, and Kat Dobbs again with HDR. So might as well be able to lead it off to them. I believe Sean will be able to start us off.
Thank you, Dan. I am, again, Sean Jean-Scale, Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy for the Rail Passengers Association. And I have a slide deck. So I'm just going to ask everyone's pardon in advance. I'm going to focus a little on the negative right now. And it's no surprise to my coworkers, but I think it's really important to be honest about where we are and where we need to be. And some of that some of the points of synchronicity I'm going to focus on are thinking about the role rail plays holistically within the U.S. transportation network. So this is the U.S. passenger miles per million over a 20-year period, and I included 2019 in there in addition to 2020. which are the most recent statistics, just so we could see the trend lines pre-pandemic. I don't think that's a surprising graph to anyone. You can't even see Amtrak's colors there. That's how small the passenger miles is. Miles as an inner city mode share. And it's just dominated by highways. And I think the next graph I'm going to show is we don't think about it in these terms because what we tend to think about is passenger rail versus freight rail. And obviously, freight rail is doing a lot better than passenger rail. There's a lot more movements, a lot of tonnage of miles carried. But it's still, freight rail is a relatively small piece of the U.S. transportation network. When you look as a part of the freight network, and when you look at these, and I got these from the BTS, when you look at these trend lines, you can see it's going in the wrong direction. So freight rail is going to grow. However, freight by truck over highways is growing faster. And it's important to recognize that, and it's important. We've been listening to the benefits of passenger rail. We've been listening to the costs of highway domination of our transportation system. So it's important to think about why this is happening. I think there's a general consensus among members of the public that highways are just, and automobiles are just more technically efficient, technologically advanced rather, and that when automobiles were invented, they just replaced passenger trains, freight trains, the same way that the internal combustion engine replaced the water mill. I don't think that's true. We've been hearing about all the ways in which rail is a really advanced technology. Steel rail, more efficient. So in an energy-constrained environment, it has a lot of advantages. Rail solves a geographic and land use problem that highways just aren't able to do and that roads just aren't able to accomplish, especially on high-capacity corridors. And we've also been hearing about, the labor shortage. And so from a labor efficiency perspective, I think AAR's figure is one freight train replaces 700 trucks. So I think we can all argue about the right crew sizes, but it's a hell of a lot less than 700 people. So we could solve our transportation labor shortage just by shifting to this more efficient mode. But why hasn't it happened? I would argue it's a political choice. So you can see here the general fund expenditure on highways since 2008 compared to the general fund expenditures on intercity rail at the federal level since over the last 50 years. So it's $270 billion for highway, $120 billion for intercity, for Amtrak specifically, and that's not the money we've spent at the government level. That is just general fund transfers to fix the highway trust fund. So we've been talking about, highways have a revenue stream. They have a pay for. They used to have a pay for, and it was always a little overstated, I think, about how much the gas tax was actually covering the capital needs of our road network. But they used to cover a lot more, and we've been having to do a lot of infusions just to keep the thing going. And the thing it has really in its corner is just a status quo bias. So I think revenue streams are important, but again, this is a political choice. We've talked about the benefits that would come with investing in a transportation funding structure that shifted freight and passengers onto the road network. So I won't go through this again, but I will, again, focusing on negative, we got to look at the cost. So starting out with the health and safety, 43,000 people died, almost 1,000 people died on our roads this year, which is a 16-year high. Again, it's going in the wrong direction. I think we are second only to South Korea in terms of economically advanced countries, in terms of highway fatalities per million miles traveled. And South Korea it's all mountains, and it's kind of close to the Arctic Circle. So I think they have a pretty good excuse. And we used to be a leader in highway safety. We used to be much better than countries like France, and we've lost ground. 5,600 of those accidents directly involved trucks and freight vehicles. And then, of course, there's the transportation emissions, which are dominated in the U.S. by greenhouse gas emissions from, rubber and asphalt freight trucks. So I'm hoping we're going to hear. We heard a lot of great solutions from the last panel, but I just wanted to point out that as long as there is this public subsidy of the highway system, the freight highway system, it will continue to dominate our freight network. And it's time to start thinking about how we bring those things into parity. You could cut the subsidies to the highway system. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think it's beholden on us to start thinking about how we can really shift a lot of public resources to this hybrid freight passenger system, and how we can work with these private sector companies to be part of their capitalization programs in a way that accomplishes some really critical national goals. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rick.
So I'm Rick Harnish. I'm the executive director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. We're a nonprofit out of Chicago, founded on the idea that if you can take a high-speed train from Madrid to Seville in 2 hours and 20 minutes, which they started running in 1993, the year that we founded, you should be able to take a train from Chicago to Detroit in 2 hours and 20 minutes. If we were to use modern technology to do Chicago to Detroit today, it would only be 90 minutes, but we'll be okay with 2 hours and 20 minutes every hour. But we're supported by our members, and our goal is to help people at the municipal level, individuals, understand why we need to do this, what it would look like, have some ideas for what can happen in North America to deal with our unique circumstances, and then help our members communicate and educate their leaders in state capitals and Washington at the appropriate times. I appreciate that Sean did the research for me that I didn't get to do. So this builds on this significantly. But earlier today we were talking about the Santa Fe Transcon, and there's a section of the Transcon, I think it's Cajon Pass, where it is in fact triple tracked. And you've also got a really long freight train coming from China, most of that freight, and heading someplace in the eastern part of the country, right? So we have excelled at moving big, long trains, and that's what the network now is designed to do. But if you, I wanted to give a little bit about, I'm sorry, you can't see it there because it changed the, but we believe in networks, which were discussed yesterday. So we think that there's 3 types of track. There's actually a lot more different ways of assembling railroads. Are incredibly versatile. But to keep this conversation simple, there's shared use. We think that's about 80% of the network that we should have. So working with private owners to figure out how to run a lot more trains, a lot more on time, both freight and passenger. In the middle is taking an existing railroad, putting it in government ownership, and focusing on frequent passenger trains. That would be regional. The Northeast Corridor is the best example of that today in North America. And then what California has started, there's a couple of segments here and there of about 200, 300 miles, where if you could just plop that into a much bigger network, it would push the entire network to much greater performance. And they tend to be around Chicago is where the highest priority should be in terms of fixing the whole country. So we believe those should be put together in a national plan that is funded, probably at about $20 billion a year. That would be kind of the minimum you'd need to do to make it work. But, and Sean gave a good case for why that's not an unreasonable number. But the first in this country to do the type of plan that we're talking about is California, and that is a visual representation of their statewide plan, which plans on having timed connections at all hubs with frequent service that runs at the same time every hour. And because you've got that high-speed line in the middle, which they're building today, it makes things in Northern California work that wouldn't work otherwise, in terms of now there's one daily round trip on a bus, but with high-speed rail feeding people into it, it can be 4 or 5, and that happens throughout the network. So this is what we think the FRA should be developing. They don't have the charge to do this yet, but we're working to make this happen. One thing I think we need to really think about, so we deal with transportation policy every 4 to 6 years, not on a real schedule, but how do we have a discussion about the big picture of what we're doing with our railroads? So Mayor Smith was talking yesterday about the deal that was struck in the 1800s, where to some railroads we gave land, and in exchange they were to be common carriers. And rail advocates tend to talk frequently about the Amtrak change to that deal. But there's some real significant changes that have happened in between. And I want to point out the one in 1920. That was when the railroads were, they were nationalized during World War I. In 1920, they were turned back to private companies. But the ICC was given the ability to truly regulate rates, which they didn't have real power to do prior to 1920. And then the other I want to point out is that we were taxing railroad tickets and putting it directly into the General Revenue Fund for about 2 decades. So you'll notice that there's a lot of really big, expensive railroad infrastructure that's about 100 years old. And I would premise that that's because in 1920, plus or minus, it became not a good investment to invest in expensive railroad infrastructure. So basically, we've had about a century of constantly managing decline, with some routes being heavily invested in, Santa Fe Transcon, being the BN Transcon, et cetera, but others continuing to deteriorate. And the railroad industry, which I think is smart from the investor's perspective, is continuing to take capital out of the system through stock buybacks. And the way we've structured the incentives for those private companies, that is the smart thing to do. So we need to change that dynamic. I don't have the answers for how we change it. We've got some examples. California is leading the way. Brightline, Florida is leading the way. We've got the Metro system works pretty well. We've got examples that we can start to build on, but I think we need to accept the fact that we're going to have to spend a lot more than $66 billion to have a network that hauls both more freight and more passengers. And we've got to figure out how to build a national coalition that makes that happen. And again, I don't have the answers. It's just kind of outlining what I think needs to be done. So I wanted to point out, so we started regulating the railroads really heavy in 1920, and then in 1921 we started heavily subsidizing the competition. And this is the current National Highway System map. So every line on that map is eligible for federal funds directly through the Highway Trust Fund. And it's a lot, right? So that brings me to an innovation that I'm disappointed doesn't fit into the existing paradigm, which is the road railer. So intermodal, it's expensive and time consuming to build long intermodal trains. You've got the tare weight of the flat cars that you're putting either the containers or the trailers onto. And so you end up with service that's not very frequent, but high value freight really needs frequency. And you've got the operating costs that need to come down in order to attract shorter markets. And that breakpoint tends to be in discussions about 750 miles. But most of the intercity freight is less than 750 miles in this country. But under the existing paradigm of putting lots of big, heavy, long trains on few railroad miles, this doesn't work because you have to operate it like a passenger train. So if we can figure out how we invest in the infrastructure for passenger trains, more than just 1 or 2 trains a day, even on long distance routes, that will also lead to coming to different answers as to what we do with the freight network. So I wanted to point out, if I may have a little bit of a sales pitch for a second. Amtrak is in the process of applying for a federal grant to start a process of rebuilding Union Station in Chicago. If we could get support showing from the region out here on paper, I think Amtrak would pay a little bit more attention and Congress would pay a little bit more attention to this. So if you go to highspeedrail.us, our website, and scroll down to Chicago Access, there's a little view about what Chicago Access is, and then some ways that you can get your mayor involved. Right now we've got a sign-on letter that we're hosting to get mayors engaged in pushing the Chicago Access program. So it's at highspeedrail.us. Thank you.
Yep, Dava, you can go next.
Oh, me, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just the importance of freight rail to America. And the reason is, very often at passenger summits, it becomes really a question of whether you're going to use the rail for passenger or freight. So I was really excited to see that we were going to talk about this in terms of synchronicity, because I think it's really easy to sort of demonize the freight railroads and say, oh, they're about making money. There's nothing wrong with being about making money. When it comes right down to it, they do a really good job. BNSF takes care of 35,000 families, including for 12 years mine. And what they do is really important to America. So here's just a couple of good statistics. A third of freight in the United States moves on rail for at least part of its journey. 40% of long-distance freight volumes move on rail. So long distance is more than 750 miles. So 40% of it moves on rail, but rail accounts for 1.9% of greenhouse gas emissions. That is really significant. If railroads stopped moving freight, do you guys have an idea of how many more trucks we would need in the United States? 99 million. 99 million more trucks if the freight railroads shut down right now. In addition, we would need 4 times the amount of fuel that we currently use in the United States to move freight. So it's something that we really need. I found this statistic really interesting. If 25% of long-distance truck traffic moved by rail instead, annual GHGs, greenhouse gases, would fall by 13.1 million tons. So we really do want things moving by freight. Now, the question is, how do you add passenger service to what is a predominantly freight network? So somebody mentioned to me during the break that somebody needed to bring this up, so I'm going to. Freight trains move slowly. The last time anybody gave me a statistic, a coal train on an American network moves at about 35 miles an hour. So they are slow. And the coal doesn't mind that it takes a little while to get where it's going. People don't want to move at 35 miles an hour. So when you're looking at the synchronicity, you really do need to consider things like what's called a meet and pass, which is how 2 trains meet and pass one another. At one point, American railroads were really excited because they were increasing their sidings, which is where you do a meet and pass. You pull into a siding. It's like pulling off onto the shoulder of the highway and letting a faster car pass you. They were building them to 8,000 feet or extending them to 8,000 feet because before that most were at most like 6,000 feet, but now we have 10,000-foot trains. So I would argue, that that's a really good thing, because the more, you're getting all kinds of increased efficiencies when you're moving longer trains. Now, that's not a good thing if you happen to be sitting at a crossing, which is why grade crossing separations are also very important. But other than that, it really is good to move more things on a longer train. But we need to figure out how to get those longer, slower trains out of the way in order to put passenger on. And so that's an area where I think that there's going to be a lot of need for investment. And that's a place where I think people often overlook what will need to be done. They concentrate on the really big, cool projects, like let's double track this, let's add a track here that's going to be just for passenger. And really, if you're putting a lot of money into sidings, I think that's helpful as well, especially just increasing the length of some of the sidings that already exist. So with that said, I will turn it over to Kat, but just wanted to point out that when we talk about this, when we talk about adding passenger, nobody's saying it isn't important. We wouldn't be here. Not a single person in this room would be here if we didn't believe in passenger rail. But you also have to believe in freight rail. And I would also say that if you're arguing against or fighting against freight rail capacity projects, and there are groups that are involved here who fight against freight capacity projects, you're not truly an ally of passenger, because if you can't increase capacity for all trains, you can't increase capacity for any trains. So just something to keep in mind. There are ways to fight a fight that you feel needs to be fought, but arguing that you shouldn't be able to increase the freight rail network is not one of them.
I agree so much with everything that you just said. And I think it gets back to a point that I hope I was able to make earlier. And that is that the host railroads, the owners of the infrastructure, are not just one stakeholder. They are, in many ways, the preeminent stakeholder, which is not to say that freight railroad interests need to be prioritized above all interest at the expense of other interests, but absolutely freight railroads need to be brought to the table. And I think to make a broader point, I think that that's what we're talking about. And when I think of what is freight and passenger synchronicity, it is about the idea of identifying mutual benefits. And you say, oh yeah, mutual benefit. Well, I'm going to get passenger rail, and you're going to host passenger rail, and you might get some infrastructure investment. And that's great. And that can be it, but that doesn't have to be it. And I think that that's the approach that historically we have seen over the past few years, at least the time that I've been in the industry, is an approach that almost people approach as us versus them. And I don't think it needs to be that way, because I think that to truly have mutual benefits, as I would define them, it is freight railroads benefiting, passenger railroads benefiting, but not at the extent of each other and not at the extent of any other stakeholders who are involved in the process. And I think that that ties broadly to how I would define equity. And it is identifying solutions that work for all stakeholders, that don't push the impacts disproportionately to one stakeholder or two stakeholders, including the freight railroads. And that also seek to distribute the benefits in a way that offers system flexibilities and user benefits for all. So I mean, it's easy to say that. It's a lot harder to say how to do it. And luckily we've had a lot of opportunity to talk today about ways to start to engage the freight railroads and to start to address conversations from a less aggravating point of view, or a less adversarial point of view, I should say, and a more collaborative point of view. We've talked about engaging early and often. I think that that's absolutely critical. I think that, not to speak for anyone from the U.S. Department of Transportation, I think that that's what they would want also. That fits in really nicely to the idea of we don't really use it in the rail world, but the environmental linkages, sort of the pre-NEPA planning efforts. So engaging freight hosts as a primary stakeholder, but also all other stakeholders early and often is part of a comprehensive planning process. And it is how stakeholders can work together to identify benefits that are not at the expense of each other. And Jim, when he was speaking on the earlier panel, he underlined very clearly that freight railroads have their own goals. They have operational goals, they have profit goals, and as you mentioned, there's no problem with that. We should all be very grateful that we live in a country that has such an advanced freight railroad system, because we all benefit from it when our packages arrive on time, and I know we all like that. So, there's capacity goals, there's cost goals, and there's carbon goals, to copy you, Jim. But I don't think that those goals need to be exclusive. And I think that there is potential for overlap in a way that can benefit many stakeholders. But I think that we need to change the adversarial mindset. And I would not expect to have a lot of success in approaching any stakeholder, but especially freight railroads that engage in such comprehensive and such long-term planning for their infrastructure assets. Don't approach with a to-do list and say, okay, well, here's what I want, and here's what you need to do for me, and oh, by the way, here's the schedule that I'm working on. That is, in my personal experience, not a way to get things done interpersonally or with any relationships, let alone business relationships. And so I think it's that opportunity to approach the freight rail providers and approach all of the stakeholders to look creatively for different ways and methods to identify benefits. And I would further encourage folks to look beyond the bills and the programs that we have right now and that have come out of the Federal Railroad Administration or that have come out of the US DOT, because I think, and we're moving away from this, but I think over the last few years that many of the programs have focused on delivering one particular type of benefits or emphasizing the value of one particular type of benefits. And I think that that's great if you're looking over the past few years, for instance, to deliver economic benefits, but it does have the ability to sort of give tunnel vision. And there are a lot of other types of benefits that can be beneficial to all of the stakeholders, but also the freight railroads. So I would really encourage to look beyond the minimum thresholds of the funding programs and to look for opportunities to creatively identify other types of system benefits or infrastructure benefits that will assist in the delivery of passenger rail, but that can also help to achieve freight rail goals. And the way that you know what the freight rail goals are is to talk to them, and to talk to them early and talk often. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to identify, for instance, state of good repair goals. I know that that's something that the freight railroads take very seriously, keeping their infrastructure in good condition. We heard that much of the infrastructure that the rail runs over, the bridges and the tunnels in this country, are very old. They're also very expensive to replace and require significant lead times to get through permitting and other regulatory hurdles. So I think that there's real opportunity there to identify if there's potential for partnership to help with those major infrastructure improvements. And as bristling as Representative DeFazio's comments were regarding freight railroads and their willingness to collaborate, he actually gave a great example of that. And the Long Bridge over the Potomac was at capacity, and now they're building another one. And that achieves the goals of both the freight rail providers and the expansion of passenger rail service. So state of good repair, major assets. Another thing that I want to encourage you to think about is what the freight railroads need to operate particularly as it relates to specific sections of rail where we're looking to deliver a passenger service. What freight rail assets are there? What customers are there that they need to continue to serve? What yards do they have? How do all of those assets relate to the current choke points that exist? And is there opportunity to identify, working with the freight railroads, targeted improvements that would help with their flexibility in their own system, which then, of course, yields to flexibility to accommodate additional passenger rail frequencies? So I think that there's some real opportunity there. And if there's one area I would like to focus on and to tell you all to think creatively about, it is resiliency. Because resiliency is something that should matter to all of us in our transportation network. And freight railroads have a real opportunity in partnership with passenger rail operators to help provide a more resilient system that we all can benefit from. I'm sure many of us have seen the pictures of after Hurricane Katrina when the interstate was flooded because the pump system failed. The high ground was the railroad, and the railroad was able to be used to help with evacuations. That is one, I would say, I wish it were extreme example, but I mean, we all have lived the past 15, 20 years and seen the way that the climate is changing and the way that extreme weather events are becoming more commonplace. There's real opportunity for partnership there. So those are just, I hope, a few practical things I would encourage you all to look at when you think about approaching the freight railroads. But again, you do so collaboratively. Say, what can we do for each other? Because I really think that there's opportunity here that's underscored by what we see right now as a historic level of investment, but does not need to be the historic level of investment over, the course of our transportation futures.
Okay, thank you for a wonderful panel there, and thank you, Kat, for sealing basically my transition comments. So let me recalibrate. But no, absolutely, and bringing it back to what Sean and Rick brought up in the beginning, that we as a nation have not taken rail at large, both passenger and freight, on par or equitable with the highway and aviation counterparts, which, yes, are also critical components of our national transportation system, but should not be a critical link failure. So really trying to broaden the perspective as we look forward to what the opportunities are for us as a nation, and the greater Northwest region in particular. What, taken together, we need to do passenger and freight projects simultaneously. I think we can be able to appreciate the magnitude of the situation and the value about engaging with counterparts early. I guess I would turn it over to whoever wants to respond about when we're envisioning with projects, how do we try to proactively foster the conversation of working with both aspects simultaneously and building the case to do a project well?
So I'll give it a shot. I think that one of the things that folks can do is they can really ask. They can ask the railroads what's going on. During RO, one of the things that I was really fascinated by was there were a lot of projects that BNSF cooperated with, where BNSF was already going to be doing a project in that area, in that geographic area. And what BNSF offered to do at the time was to say, we've already made a commitment in our own capital plan. We plan on spending this money. You want to do this larger project, and some of it is going to benefit us. It's going to help us with safety record because we're going to have grade separations, or you're going to allow us to move a track so that we have a better way in and out of our yard, or you're going to close a street so that it's easier for us to move our track around, but there's some freight benefit here. So we were going to spend this money anyway. We will put that up as part of your match. So then those projects became phenomenally competitive because they had this huge private sector match in addition to state matches or anything else. One example of that was a project I was really involved with. In fact, for a while, I was kind of the program manager on it, called Tower 55 in downtown Fort Worth, where the BNSF and the UP partnered with the city of Fort Worth, TxDOT, the TRE, which is Trinity Railway Express. It's a local commuter railroad, DART. There were just a ton of groups that got together BNSF and UP each put in something like $40 million. It was a significant amount of money, and that allowed the BNSF and the UP to solve traffic issues that this won't make as much of a, it won't be as big here, but we were literally backing up traffic from Dallas-Fort Worth all the way to Waco, and then north all the way to the state line because it was so hard to get through the interchange in Fort Worth. And as a result, the air quality impacts were better. But the best thing, I think, was the fact that in a neighborhood in Fort Worth, in a particularly economically disadvantaged area, we had had generations of people where the parents taught their children how to safely climb under the train in order to get to school on time because there would be blocked crossings. Just FYI, you cannot safely climb under a train. Don't teach your child that. But for generations, literally, people had been teaching their kids, you know, look around, here are the signs that the train might move, here's what you should do. So this had a really wonderful impact on this community, but it was also a situation where BNSF and UP got something that they desperately needed. They got to move rail traffic much more efficiently. They got to improve, you know, their own return on investment, and you know, there was this benefit to everybody, including passenger rail. I would look for those types of situations where you know that there's a bridge that you have a really good feeling the railroad's probably going to be replacing. Is that something that you could put into your own project? Does everybody here know what PTC is? That's come up a couple times over the last couple of days. Okay, people need to know what PTC is. So PTC is something called positive train control. I am not a positive train control expert, but it's a signaling system that was mandated by Congress that, in a nutshell, keeps trains from running into each other. It will cause a train to brake automatically, whether or not the engineer asks it to. It is required that PTC be on any route that's moving hazmat or passengers. So here's another thing that came up this morning. Jim Tylick mentioned that in Colorado, they'd put PTC on a non-mandated route. That means a route that otherwise would not have been carrying passengers or hazmat. Are there areas where you could be saying, hey, host railroad, are you guys considering putting PTC on this line? Because we see in the future the possibility that we might want to move passengers on the line. Could we support you in going after a grant to put PTC on a non-mandated line? So there are a lot of things I think that you could do that could really help the freights. And the nice thing is, you never want the first time you approach somebody to be with an ask. You know, hey, we want to put a bunch of passenger rail on your lines. It's really good to establish a relationship first. So if you could be going into the freight railroads and saying, what projects are you guys putting forward for, you know, where are you trying to get grants? Could we support you in them? We see the value of freight rail to our community, and we want to support you. Now, down the line, we're really hoping that we can run passenger, where, you know, this might be new passenger service, it might be increased passenger service, but look, we understand that our passenger service shouldn't stop your freight service and shouldn't in any way impede your ability to move freight. And we're willing to put our money where our mouth is, or at least our letter of support where our mouth is. We're willing to say that we support your projects. That's going to go a long way. In North Carolina and Virginia, they have been working with the Eastern Roads for a long time to build that type of relationship, and they just got the biggest raise grant of anyone in order to increase passenger service in North Carolina and Virginia. And they could not have done that if they had not developed those types of relationships with the Eastern Roads. So it's something definitely to think about.
Were you involved in the 6 universal crossovers in Iowa? That's one that's fascinated me with RFI.
Oh, I was, but it's been a long time.
Okay.
I'll just build off your point because I thought that was a really good one. In places where we've seen really constructive relationships between passenger and the freight railroads, host railroads, I'm thinking about the Capitol Corridor in Northern California, and we've already talked about Virginia passenger rail. They identified a local funding source. They dedicated staff resources within the transportation agency so that they could build a relationship with the host railroad, that they could take part in their capital renewal planning process, where the freight railroad could count on them coming to the table consistently with public funding to enhance the infrastructure, and that they could build, a level of trust about that there was going to be funding in the future, but also that the service outcome agreements would be honored. And so it takes time, unfortunately, and that's something we don't really have with the 5-year horizon. But I do think there's no better time to start than now, and identifying again a local source. In Virginia, it was there was a sales tax that was kind of dedicated to passenger rail as a percentage, and so that's really important to kind of knowing that proving that you're going to be a partner and not just, hey, we're going to invest one time in 20 years and then we'll be back again in 20 years and ask for more. So I'll close on that.
All right, thank you. And looking at the time, let me try to get one question in here and then turn it over to the floor for what we have. But thinking about the opportunities we all have as a nation and a region with the IIJA, and trying to see with the magnitude of work that really can and should be done for the magnitude of our transportation system at large, how can we utilize the opportunities of the IIJ not as a down payment and building momentum for the future, and not just a one-time flash in the pan, but really trying to be able to recalibrate an inequitable transportation system?
So the first thing is we've got to have some successes. And I don't care where they are, how big they are. Let's figure out how to get something that people can see as an immediate improvement. So we need both long-term, short-term successes that we can get out the door quickly. There's a number of those that have been in process that maybe we don't even need that money, but let's get them done. And then building now the idea of a national network and a national coalition that is supporting kind of the key planning for the high impact projects, the ones that will really make a difference nationally, and making sure those get underway while also getting planning going for other projects. But it's this mix you have to balance between immediate success and long-term planning, big projects and small projects. But really the core is we now have an opportunity. We need to get the message out all around the country. This isn't it. This is the first step. We need more steps. Let's work together to make it happen.
Yeah, I would only add to that I think in order to do that, it takes some discipline and some inward focus to be really honest about where a project is in its developmental life cycle. And programs of the past, again, they have focused on the term that I don't really think anyone likes, shovel ready. We want to be shovel ready. Let's be shovel ready. Okay, well, shovel ready for a corridor project is very different than shovel ready for like a focused siding extension, just as an example. In terms of the level of documentation, planning, NEPA, everything that goes into it. But there is an opportunity. I think that we all as an industry want successes. And the biggest sin that we collectively could engage in or that we could commit is in 5 or 6 years when all of the infrastructure bill money is gone, not have anything to show for it or just have planning. So I think that finding the balance of the low-hanging fruit that are at the right developmental stage to push into final design and construction activities is really important. but it is also building up that pipeline of projects that maybe are not ready right now, because realistically, everything is not ready. There's an opportunity to pursue the planning and certainly the PE and NEPA that is necessary to get those projects ready for funding and to queue them up for success in the future fiscal years of the programs that we know today.
Thank you. And looking at the time, using moderator's prerogative, I'm going to turn over here for questions and comments.
I just want to correct the record from something that Dava said. Tower 55, yes, was made possible by $40 million put into that project by the freight railroads, and $34 million put into that project by the Federal Railroad Administration. So that was a good example of a public-private partnership, but it wouldn't have happened without the good folks at the USDOT. So, and one other thing that I wanted to say, and frankly, my chairman would say it if so, I'm kind of, anyway. The question needs to be asked when the freight railroads are running 10 to 15,000 foot trains, we're talking 2 to 3 miles, who should pay for the sidings so those trains can not only get out of the way of Amtrak, but they can get out of the way of other freight trains on the same track. I know of some rail lines today that run one-way service day after day because the trains are too long to run trains both ways on the same day. So the question is, who ought to pay for that?
Receiving yards, making sure the receiving yards are.
And I'm sorry, that's a really good point. So yeah, FRA, when I mentioned that, they got a grant from FRA that was huge, and for Tower 55, and it was really an amazing opportunity. It was a good example of a public-private partnership. And then, yeah, the city of Fort Worth put in money, TxDOT put in money. Like there were a lot of funders there, and it's a really good project.
Again, thank you all for coming today, and then thank you for an excellent discussion and key points to consider looking forward into the future. How do we be able to move forward constructively with the opportunities we have before us and be proactive rather than reactive? So now we'll have a 10-minute break before we start the next session.